The desert keeps no memories. It is an entity of timeless, merciless indifference. It swallows stories, burying secrets beneath a sun-scorched blanket of sand, and it gives them back only on its own terms, often when they are least expected. Our story begins on such a day, under the vast, unforgiving sky of Arizona, where the line between life and death is as thin as a whisper. It was August of 2012. The heat, a blistering 113 degrees Fahrenheit, suffocated the arid lands near the legendary Superstition Mountains. The air was thick and shimmering, distorting the horizon into a hazy, uncertain mirage. In the midst of this harsh landscape, a lone hiker was paying the price for his overconfidence. He had pushed further than planned. His water supply was dangerously low, and every step now felt like lifting a lead weight. All around him, the silence of the desert was nearly absolute, broken only by his own ragged breaths and the sigh of the wind through the giant saguaro cacti, the silent sentinels of this land. Suddenly, a subtle change. The hot breeze began to carry a different scent, the smell of damp earth and ozone. The hiker looked up. On the horizon, a wall of bruised black clouds was rising with an alarming speed, swallowing the sun and casting a sickly gray light over the world. He knew what was coming. The Arizona monsoon. He had no time. What began as a distant rumble quickly grew into a furious roar. From the mouth of a nearby canyon, a wall of brown water, mud, and debris erupted, transforming the dry wash into a raging river. The hiker scrambled, his heart pounding in his chest, pulling himself up a rocky outcrop, just as the flash flood tore through the space where he had stood moments before. He watched in horror as the torrent ripped trees from their roots and tossed boulders aside as if they were pebbles. It was nature's raw, untamable fury on full display. The deluge was as brief as it was violent. As the water receded, it left behind a world remade, a landscape gouged and scarred. An eerie silence descended once more. As the hiker caught his breath, his eyes scanned the devastation, and then he saw it. Sticking out from a freshly eroded sandbank was the corner of a dark, weathered piece of canvas. Curiosity overriding his fear, he cautiously made his way down the slippery rocks. He began to dig with his bare hands, the wet sand cool against his skin. The object was heavy, unnervingly so. He pulled and tugged until the entire bundle, wrapped crudely in the old tarp and tied with rotted rope, came free. He fumbled with the knot, his fingers still shaking. The canvas fell open. The hiker recoiled, a gasp escaping his lips. Inside were the unmistakable, sun-bleached shapes of human bones, tangled in the tattered remains of old clothing. It was a grim, silent tomb. But nestled within the skeletal remains was something else, something carefully protected from the elements. A waterproof leather pouch. Inside it, miraculously preserved, was an old map. He thought it was just the tragic remains of a long-lost hiker. He didn't know that the map he held in his trembling hands was the key to a 5-year-old murder and a discovery worth killing for. To understand the secret held within that map, we must travel back in time. 5 years earlier, to 2007. To the small, dusty town of Apache Junction, where the legend of the Old West still lingered in the air. Back then, the talk of the town was a man named Silas Whitaker. To outsiders, Si, as everyone called him, might have seemed like just another eccentric old prospector, a relic from a bygone era. But to the locals, he was a living legend. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, carved by decades under the Arizona sun, but his eyes held the bright, unshakable optimism of a true believer. He was, perhaps, the last of the great Western dreamers. Silas had dedicated his entire life to a single, all-consuming quest, the search for the lost Sparrow Silver gold mine. It was a local legend, a ghost story whispered over beers in smoky saloons for over a century, a fable of a lost vein of gold, so rich it could make a king of any man who found it. While others dismissed it as folklore, Silas believed. He believed with every fiber of his being. He wasn't just chasing gold, he was chasing a dream. In October of 2007, the crisp autumn air seemed to buzz with new promise. Silas told his few close friends that he felt closer than ever, that he had a new theory, a new map, a new path. He packed his old beat-up Ford pickup truck and headed out towards the superstitions, just as he had hundreds of times before. But this time he didn't come back. A week later, his truck was found parked at the head of a remote, little-used trail. A short hike in, searchers found his campsite. It was neat, orderly, and deeply unsettling. His small tent was set up. A half-full pot of coffee sat cold over an unlit fire pit. His sleeping bag was still rolled out, but Silas was gone. More disturbing, however, were the things that were missing. His specialized leather prospecting bag, which held his geologist's hammer, his tools, and his most precious samples, was gone. And so were his maps, the meticulously drawn charts that were the culmination of his life's work. A massive search and rescue operation was launched. Helicopters sliced through the air, their rotors beating against the vast silence. Teams on foot and on horseback combed the treacherous canyons, shouting his name until their throats were raw. They searched for weeks, but the desert held its secrets close. The Superstition Mountains are a labyrinth of stone and shadow, a place that does not suffer fools and rarely gives up its dead. Hope slowly bled out into the dust. The town mourned. The official police report offered a simple, tragic, and all too common conclusion. Silas Whittaker, like so many prospectors before him, had likely wandered too far, gotten lost, and succumbed to the elements. It was a sad end to a long life, a cautionary tale that would be told for years to come. The case was closed, and Silas Whittaker became just another ghost haunting the canyons, his dream buried with him somewhere in the unforgiving wilderness. Or so everyone thought. When the story of the hiker and his grisly discovery reached the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, it was initially logged as just another sad resolution to a long, cold missing persons case. Anonymous bones turning up in the vastness of the desert was a grim, but not uncommon, reality. The file was assigned to Detective Maria Flores, a veteran investigator with 2 decades of experience etched into the focused lines around her eyes. But Flores was different. She was born and raised in Arizona. The desert dust and its whispered legends were as much a part of her as blood and bone. She had grown up hearing tales of Silas "Cy" Whittaker. To her, he wasn't just a name on a faded file, he was a piece of the land's memory. Dental records quickly confirmed what Flores had suspected. The remains belonged to Silas Whittaker. The news brought a somber sense of closure to the small community, a final answer to the fate of their beloved old prospector. The case seemed ready for its final stamp, an epilogue to a local legend. But then the medical examiner's report landed on Flores's desk, and it changed everything. Flores read the single sheet of paper twice, her eyes narrowing. Cause of death. Not dehydration. Not animal predation. Not an accidental fall. The report was clinically precise. Cranial fractures consistent with significant blunt force trauma. The cracks in the skull were not the result of time or nature. They were the unmistakable signature of violence. Silas Whittaker had not died alone. He had been murdered. The air in the investigative unit grew thick. A 5-year-old cold case was suddenly, violently alive. It was no longer a tragic accident, but a homicide. Every piece of evidence recovered from the wash was laid out and re-examined under this new sinister light. And at the center of it all, lying inert in a plastic evidence bag, was the old map. At first glance it looked like junk. It was a souvenir map, printed in garish colors with cartoonish illustrations of miners and donkeys advertising the Sparrow Creek gold mine, a tourist trap that had gone bankrupt and shut its gates in the 1992nd. It was the kind of cheap trinket anyone could have bought for a few dollars. Most detectives would have logged it and moved on. But for Flores, something felt wrong. Why would a man like Silas, a serious, lifelong prospector on the verge of what he believed was a major discovery, treat this cheap souvenir with such care? Why was this the one item he had protected in a waterproof pouch, while his very life had been left to the elements? Her intuition gnawed at her. She sent the map to the forensics lab with a simple request. Check for anything that isn't supposed to be there. The forensics lab was a sterile, quiet world away from the desert heat. A young technician, accustomed to running tests on more obvious evidence, looked at the flimsy map with skepticism, but he followed procedure. The room was darkened. The switch for the high-intensity ultraviolet lamp was flicked on, bathing the room in an ethereal purple glow. He passed the lamp over the map. At first, nothing. Then, as he adjusted the wavelength, a faint, ghost-like luminescence began to appear on the paper's surface. It started as a faint web of lines, almost like a watermark. The technician leaned in closer, his skepticism melting into fascination. He and Flores watched, captivated, as a hidden layer of information bloomed into existence under the UV light. It was a second map, drawn with invisible ink, directly over the printed tourist guide. There were meticulously handwritten notes in a cramped, urgent script. There were strange symbols, cryptic geological markers that meant nothing to the technician but would make a prospector's heart race. And there was a new path. This secret trail ignored the cheerful looping paths of the tourist mine completely. It started behind the abandoned main building, snaked its way through a series of what looked like forgotten tunnels, and pushed deep into a remote, unexplored section of federal land that bordered the old attraction. The cheap souvenir was a palimpsest, a key. Silas had been using the defunct tourist trap as a cover, a secret entrance to his real work. The discovery sent a jolt of electricity through the investigation, but another piece of the puzzle was waiting. The small, worn leather pouch found with the remains also contained a few small, heavy pebbles. They were gold nuggets. They were sent for geochemical analysis, a standard procedure. The report that came back was anything but standard. The lab explained it to Flores in simple terms. Every gold deposit has a unique chemical signature, a specific ratio of trace elements like silver, copper, and zinc. The signature of the gold from the known Sparrow Creek area was well documented. The nuggets found on Silas Whitaker's body did not match. They weren't even close. Their chemical composition was entirely unique, alien to the geology of the region. Flores stood before the evidence board, the two reports in her hand. One confirmed that Silas Whitaker was murdered. The other confirmed he had found a source of gold that, according to every known geological survey, should not exist. A 5-year-old murder and a ghost mine. The case had just cracked wide open. Thousands of miles away, in a world of brick, ivy, and academic theory, Professor Jenna Whitaker was preparing for her afternoon lecture on American frontier history. Her office was a sanctuary of order, surrounded by leather-bound books and carefully catalogued research. Her life was one of facts, of peer-reviewed certainties and logical deductions. She dealt in the verifiable past, a world completely divorced from the one her uncle, Cy, had inhabited, a world she had always seen as driven by myth, fantasy, and a stubborn, foolish hope. The phone on her desk rang, a jarring interruption. It was a Detective Maria Flores from a county in Arizona she had barely heard of. The detective's voice was professional, calm, but carried a weight that traveled through the phone line. "Are you the niece of Silas Whitaker?" Jenna's world tilted. The news that they had found her uncle's remains after all these years was a shock, a sad but expected end to a long period of uncertainty. She felt a familiar pang of sorrow for the gentle, eccentric man she had loved, but never truly understood. But then the detective delivered the next blow. "Ma'am," Flores said, her voice softening slightly, "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but we are treating your uncle's death as a homicide." Homicide. The word didn't compute. It was an academic term, a headline, something that happened to other people in other worlds. It didn't belong in the same sentence as her Uncle C, the harmless dreamer. The quiet, lonely death she had pictured for him in the desert was a tragic fantasy. The reality was violent and horrifying. After the call ended, Jenna sat motionless in her chair, the sounds of the university fading into a dull roar in her ears. A wave of guilt, cold and immense, washed over her, so powerful it took her breath away. It wasn't just grief, it was a profound and sickening regret. Her mind flooded with memories, each one a fresh torment. She remembered their last phone call, her pleading with him to finally give up, to sell his small house and move closer to her. "You're chasing ghosts, Uncle Si," she had said, her voice laced with the well-intentioned condescension of a pragmatist. "It's a waste of your life." She remembered his patient, gentle laugh. "It's only a waste if you don't love the chase, Jenna," he'd replied. "And I love the chase." She had seen his passion as a flaw, a delusion she needed to correct. Now she was faced with the devastating truth. His dream wasn't a ghost, it was real. Real enough that someone had killed him for it. The very quest she had belittled, the discovery she had refused to believe in, was the reason for his murder. Her ignorance felt like a betrayal. Her skepticism felt like an accomplice. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. Over the next few hours that crushing guilt began to burn, transforming into something else. It curdled into a fierce, desperate need for the truth. Jenna was a historian. Her entire life, her entire career, was dedicated to uncovering facts, to sifting through lies and legends to find the verifiable core of what truly happened. She had spent years analyzing the motives of people long dead. Now the most important historical investigation of her life had fallen into her lap. It was personal. Her resolve hardened. This was no longer something she could observe from a distance. She couldn't delegate her grief or her responsibility. She had to go. She had to stand in that desert, breathe that air, and understand the world that had consumed the man she had so badly misjudged. She picked up the phone and canceled her classes for the remainder of the week. She went home, packed a small bag with a numb efficiency, and booked the next flight to Phoenix, Arizona. As the plane ascended, leaving the green, orderly world of the East Coast behind, she stared out the window into the darkness. She was flying towards the desert, a place she had always associated with her uncle's foolishness and failure. Now it was a crime scene, a place of murder, mystery, and a truth she had to uncover, not just for him, but for herself. It was a pilgrimage of atonement. Jenna Whitaker stepped out of the Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport and into a wall of heat. It was a dry, oppressive force, so different from the humid summers she was used to. The sun was a white, blinding disk in a vast pale blue sky. As she waited for the rental car shuttle, she looked out at the distant, jagged mountains silhouetted against the horizon. This was his world. A world of brutal sun, sharp edges, and distances so great they seemed to swallow all ambition. For the first time she felt the physical reality of the life her uncle had chosen, and it felt like a foreign planet. Her first meeting with Detective Maria Flores took place in a small, sterile conference room at the sheriff's office. Flores was exactly as her voice had sounded on the phone, professional, sharp, with a calm, steady gaze that seemed to miss nothing. There was an initial wariness in the detective's posture, the caution of an officer accustomed to dealing with the unpredictable emotions of grieving families. She expected tears, anger, or a desperate need for platitudes. She did not expect Jenna Whitaker. Jenna was not hysterical. Her grief was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, fueling a focus that was as intense as the detective's own. She carried a leather satchel filled not with tissues, but with notebooks and copies of her uncle's old journals. "I need to understand what happened, Detective," Jenna said, her voice even. "I am a historian. I deal in facts and primary sources. Please show me everything you have." Seeing the quiet determination in Jenna's eyes, Flores made a decision. This woman wasn't a liability. She might be an asset. The two women relocated to the main evidence room, the air thick with the scent of old paper and sterilized plastic. Flores laid out the case file, the photographs, and the evidence bags on a large steel table. "The hiker found him here," she began, pointing to a spot on a large topographical map. 5 years of sun and seasonal floods did their work, but the me was certain. This was not a natural death. She slid the coroner's report across the table. Jenna read the clinical description of the fractures, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the table. Then Flores moved to the centerpiece of the investigation. She picked up the plastic bag containing the cheap tourist map. "This was found with him," Flores explained, "preserved in a waterproof pouch. At first we thought it was just a meaningless personal effect." She led Jenna to a forensic analysis station in the corner of the room. She darkened the room and switched on the UV lamp. And just as she had a few days prior, Flores watched as the secret revealed itself. For Jenna, the moment was transformative. As the invisible ink glowed to life, she wasn't just seeing a clue. She was seeing a part of her uncle she had never known, a part she had actively denied. The meticulous notes, the precise symbols, the sheer, brilliant cunning of using a worthless souvenir to hide a discovery of a lifetime, it was the work of a genius, not a fool. Her image of him as a simple, misguided dreamer shattered, replaced by the portrait of a man who was clever, patient, and methodical. As a historian, she felt a profound, unexpected surge of professional admiration, immediately followed by a fresh wave of personal guilt. She had analyzed the minds of historical figures from fragments of their letters. All the while, she had failed to read the brilliant mind of the man who was her own family. "He was hiding in plain sight," Jenna whispered, her fingers tracing the glowing path on the map, not quite touching the glass. "He knew people would be watching him. He knew the competition, so he created a layer of disinformation, a historical source with a hidden text, a palimpsest." Flores nodded, impressed. "That's one word for it. Now look at this." She placed a small, heavy evidence bag in Jenna's hand. Inside, a few dull yellowish rocks sat inert. Gold nuggets. Also found in the pouch. Jenna felt their weight. They felt real, substantial. So he found it. The Lost Sparrow mine wasn't a myth. "Not exactly," Flores corrected. She handed Jenna another lab report. "This is a geochemical analysis. In short, every gold source has a unique fingerprint, a specific mix of other minerals. The fingerprint of these nuggets doesn't match anything from the old Sparrow Creek tourist mine. In fact, it doesn't match anything from any known deposit in the entire region. This is what we call foreign gold. Your uncle didn't find the Lost Sparrow mine, Professor. It seems he found his own." The weight of the nuggets in her hand suddenly felt immense. It was irrefutable, scientific proof. His life's work, his dream, validated by mass spectrometry. And it was this tangible proof of his success, that had gotten him killed. They moved back to the main evidence board, where photos of the crime scene and the evidence were pinned. "So we have the what," Flores said, her voice low and focused. "He found a new, high-grade gold deposit. And we have the how. He was murdered for it. Now we need the who." "The killer took his prospecting tools," Jenna observed, her mind working, analyzing the data points like a historical problem. "His hammer, his pans, his sample bags, all gone. But they left the map." "Exactly," Flores affirmed, "which tells us they were unsophisticated. They thought the value was in the tools, in the act of digging. They saw him as a simple laborer." Jenna looked at the glowing map, then back at the board. A cold clarity began to form in her mind. "They didn't know what they were looking at," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They didn't understand that his true value wasn't in his hands, it was in his head. They were common thieves, detective, not prospectors. They were after the gold he had, not the gold he knew how to find." Detective Flores looked at the professor, a newfound respect in her eyes. The historian's insight was razor-sharp. They now had a profile of their killer, someone close enough to know Silas's habits, greedy enough to kill for a few nuggets, and foolish enough to leave behind the key to a multi-million-dollar discovery. The picture of the crime was becoming clearer. Now they had to find the face to put in the frame. "To find our killer," Detective Flores said, grabbing her car keys from the desk, "we can't stay in the lab. We have to go out there. We need to step into C's world." Hell, that world, as Jenna soon discovered, was a closed and guarded community of men and women who lived by their own code, chasing fortunes under the desert sun. Their first stop was a local institution, a dark, dusty saloon on the edge of Apache Junction called the Prospector's Rest. It was the kind of place where the beer was always cold, the floor was always gritty, and the walls were soaked with a century of whispered stories, boasts, and busted dreams. This was where the real history of the mountains was passed down, not in books, but in barroom conversations. As Flores and Jenna entered, the low hum of chatter died down for a moment. All eyes turned to them, the locals instantly recognizing Flores as law enforcement and Jenna as an outsider. Flores, unfazed, led them to a corner booth where two old-timers sat hunched over their drinks. They were leathery and sun-beaten, with hands as tough as old boots. They were men who had known Silas Whittaker for 40 years. After introductions and a round of drinks, Flores gently guided the conversation. "We're trying to piece together C's last few weeks," she said, "trying to understand who he was spending his time with." The older of the two men, a prospector named Hank, swirled the ice in his glass. "Si mostly kept to himself towards the end. Got real quiet. Said he was on to something big. We all thought he was just chasing the same old ghost." He paused, then looked at Jenna with rheumy, sympathetic eyes. "Sorry for your loss, ma'am. He was a good man. One of the last of the old breed." "Did he have trouble with anyone?" Jenna asked directly, her historian's mind cutting straight to the point of conflict. Hank and the other man, Earl, exchanged a knowing glance. "Trouble had a name back then," Earl grumbled into his glass. "The Hayes brothers. Jed and Travis." The names hung in the air. Flores leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about them." "Greedy bastards," Hank spat. "Not real prospectors. They were claim jumpers. Bullies. They'd let an old-timer do all the hard work, and if they thought you'd found a bit of color, they'd move in, shoulder you out. Use threats. A couple of guys got run off their claims by them. They were bad news." Earl nodded in agreement. "And they were obsessed with C. They were convinced the old man knew something he wasn't telling. They followed him sometimes. Watched him from a distance. Si knew it too. Told me. It made his skin crawl." Then Earl leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I saw it myself. Maybe 3-4 weeks before he went missing. Right here in this bar. Si was sitting right where you are, Professor. The Hayes brothers came in, drunk and mean. Jed got right in Si's face." Jenna could picture the scene vividly. "What did they say?" "Jed was yelling that Si was prospecting on land that should have been theirs, that he was trespassing." Travis stood behind him, just smiling this real, ugly smile. "Si, he just sat there, calm as you please. He looked Jed right in the eye and said, 'The only thing I'm trespassing on is your fantasy, son. The mountain decides who finds what, not bullies.'" Jed went red in the face, looked like he was about to swing at the old man. The bartender had to step in and throw them out. But as they were leaving, Jed pointed at Si and yelled, "We'll get what's ours, old man, one way or another." The testimony was chilling. It wasn't just a motive, it was a direct, public threat. Their next stop was the place where the secret trail on Silas's map began, the derelict Sparrow Creek gold mine. The drive there was quiet, the weight of the old prospector's story settling over both women. The mine itself was a monument to failure. A large cartoonish sign with faded paint reading, "Pan for Real Gold," hung at a crooked angle. The buildings were dilapidated, their windows boarded up. A heavy chain was slung across the entrance, with a rusty hand-painted sign that read, "Private Property. Keep Out." As they got out of the car, a man emerged from the shadowy porch of the main building. He was large and slovenly, with a sour, suspicious face and a shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. "This is private property," he barked, his voice a low growl. "Can't you read the sign?" Flores held up her badge. "Detective Flores, Maricopa County. We're investigating a cold case, the disappearance of Silas Whittaker." The man's eyes, small and hard, flickered for a fraction of a second. "Never heard of him," he grunted. "Now get off my land. This was Bert Corrigan." "We have reason to believe Mr. Whittaker may have been in this area before he disappeared," Jenna said, stepping forward. "We were hoping to just have a look around the perimeter." "You ain't looking at nothing," Corrigan snapped, tightening his grip on the shotgun. "You want to come on my land, you come back with a warrant." His hostility was a wall. It was more than just a recluse's desire for privacy. It was aggressive, defensive. As he was shouting at them to leave, Jenna's eyes scanned the area. Her gaze, trained to spot details others might miss, noticed something out of place. Partially hidden behind a crumbling wall were fresh tire tracks in the dust tracks that were wider and heavier than those that would be made by the ancient, rusted-out pickup truck parked near the house. And near the tracks, a small glinting object caught the sun, A modern, stainless steel washer, clean and new, completely at odds with the decay surrounding it. Forced to retreat, Flores and Jenna got back in their car. They drove away in silence, the image of the hostile man with the shotgun fresh in their minds. They now had names and faces for their abstract theories. They had the Hayes brothers, a pair of violent competitors with a known grudge and a history of threats. And they had Bert Corrigan, a surly, defensive recluse, aggressively guarding a worthless property that happened to be the starting point for Silas's secret path to a fortune. The web was no longer invisible. They could see the first few threads connecting the violent brothers to the man sitting on the X that marked the spot. They didn't have proof yet, not even close, but they had a direction. The hunt had truly begun. The silence inside the rental car, as Jenna and Detective Flores drove away from the dilapidated Sparrow Creek mine, was heavier than the desert heat itself. The confrontation with Bert Corrigan had left a sour aftertaste, a feeling that they had just poked a hornet's nest. His hostility hadn't been that of a simple man who wanted to be left alone. It was something more ferocious, a desperate defense, as if he were guarding the very gates of hell. On the large whiteboard back at the sheriff's office, there were now 3 faces of interest: Jed Hayes, Travis Hayes, and Bert Corrigan. 3 separate pins on a map of criminality. They had the aggressive competitors, and they had the secretive guardian. What they lacked was a straight line connecting them. Jenna, with her historian's mind, felt a familiar impulse. She was accustomed to looking at the fragments of the past, a letter, a journal entry, an old map, and searching for the patterns, the hidden connections that others missed. "What do we have on their backgrounds?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Corrigan and the Hayes brothers, do they know each other beyond just living in the same county?" That question ignited the next phase of the investigation. Detective Flores, for all her belief in intuition and interviews, knew that the foundation of any solid case was built on paper. She returned to her desk, not to re-examine forensic reports, but to begin a deep dive into public records, a hunt through the mundane world of birth certificates, marriage licenses, court filings, and property deeds. She wanted to draw a family tree for her suspicion. She typed their names into state and federal databases, patiently sifting through mountains of data, searching for a common thread. And then she found it. It didn't arrive with a thunderclap. It came in the quiet of an air-conditioned office, under the hum of fluorescent lights, on a grainy PDF scan of a birth certificate from nearly 60 years ago. The name of the mother on Bert Corrigan's birth certificate was Patricia Hayes. A quick cross-reference confirmed it. Patricia was the older sister of Jed and Travis Hayes' father. Bert Corrigan and the Hayes brothers were first cousins. Flores leaned back in her chair, a cold chill running down her spine despite the heat outside. This was it. This was the straight line. The 3 separate pins on her board now merged into a single, closed triangle, a solid structure of potential conspiracy. Corrigan's hostility at the mine was no longer the act of an eccentric. He wasn't just a recluse. He was a gatekeeper. He was protecting family assets. The Hayes brothers' feud with Silas was no longer simple competition. It was colored with the possibility of an inside track, a craving that had logistical support. Flores called Jenna, who was in her motel room surrounded by copies of her uncle's journals. "I've got something for you," Flores said, her voice even but betraying an unmistakable current of excitement. Corrigan and the Hayes brothers. Their family. For Jenna, the news was like finding the cipher to a coded text. It changed the interpretation of everything. "That means they could have coordinated," Jenna said instantly. "Corrigan controls the access point. The Hayes brothers had the muscle and the motive. It's a coordinated operation." "Exactly," Flores agreed. "But it's still speculation. We have a link, but we don't have proof of what they did. We need someone on the inside, someone who saw something, heard something. We need a crack in their wall of silence." The hunt for a weak link began. The Hayes brothers' petty criminal records provided a name. Travis Hayes, the younger brother, had endured a volatile relationship and a bitter breakup with a woman named Brenda Mae Thompson several years prior. Police reports from domestic disputes painted a picture of control and intimidation on Travis's part. Brenda Mae might have a reason to talk. She might be scared, but fear often walked hand in hand with resentment. She was their best bet. Finding Brenda wasn't easy. She had changed her name, moved away from Apache Junction, and tried to erase all traces of her past. But Flores was good at her job. She found Brenda living in a modest apartment complex in Mesa, a world away from the new house and flashy trucks that rumor said the Hayes brothers now owned. When Flores and Jenna knocked on Brenda's apartment door, the woman who answered looked tired and wary. Her eyes widened in fear as she recognized Flores from an unpleasant encounter in the past, and Jenna's presence only added to her confusion. "I've got nothing to say to you," Brenda said immediately, trying to shut the door. "I'm done with Travis. I don't want any trouble." "We're not here to cause you trouble, Brenda," Flores said, putting a gentle hand on the door. "We just need to ask you a few questions about something that happened 5 years ago. About Silas Whitaker." The name meant nothing to Brenda, but the mention of Travis and a specific time frame made her flinch. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll hurt me. You don't know what they're like." This was the critical moment. Flores began the standard reassurance, offering protection, appealing to her civic duty. But Jenna saw something else in the woman's eyes beyond the fear. She saw the deep, simmering anger of someone who had been wronged. Jenna stepped forward. "My name is Jenna Whitaker," she said softly. "Silas was my uncle. He was murdered." She let the word hang in the air. "Brenda, I'm not a cop. I'm just trying to find out who killed a member of my family. A kind, gentle man who wouldn't hurt a soul. You said Travis and his brother might hurt you. I believe you. Because people who hurt women are the same kind of people who would hurt an old man. They're bullies. They're users. And right now, they've gotten away with everything." Jenna's words, filled with her own raw grief and conviction, struck a chord that Flores's professional approach couldn't. Brenda looked at Jenna's face, seeing not an investigator, but another woman who had been harmed by the Hayes' toxic world. The fear in her eyes was slowly eclipsed by a hardened resolve. She took a deep breath and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. Inside the small, neat apartment, Brenda sat twisting her hands in her lap. "What do you want to know?" "I want you to tell us about late 2007, early 2008, Flores began. "Did anything change with Travis and Jed around that time?" Brenda let out a short, bitter laugh. "Change? Yeah, you could say that. It was like they won the lottery. Before then, they were always broke, always angry about it. Complaining about other prospectors, complaining about being unlucky. Then, all of a sudden, they had money. Not just a little, wads of cash. Travis came home one day and paid off all his debts in cash. A few weeks later, they bought brand new, top-of-the-line pickup trucks in cash." "Where did they say the money came from?" Jenna asked, leaning forward. "That was the thing," Brenda said, shaking her head. "It was always a different story, a vague story. We hit a lucky streak, found a real nice pocket. Just some smart prospecting. But they could never tell me where. They never showed me any gold. It was just cash. Appearing out of nowhere. A few months after that, they put a down payment on a new house. I knew something was wrong. That kind of luck doesn't just happen. This was it. The timeline matched perfectly. Silas disappeared in October 2007. A few months later, his potential killers were flush with cash." "Did they ever talk about the old Sparrow Creek mine?" Flores asked, keeping her voice casual. "Their cousin's place?" Brenda's eyes narrowed in recollection. "Talk about it? They were always there. Always. They called it helping out Cousin Bert, or working on the family property. At least 2 or 3 times a week they'd be gone all day, sometimes late into the night. I thought it was weird. I mean, that place is a wreck. What could 3 grown men possibly be doing there all the time? It's not like they were fixing it up to reopen it." "What were they doing there?" Jenna pressed. "I don't know," Brenda confessed. "They were so secretive about it. They'd come home covered in dust, not just surface dust, but that deep-down mine dirt, and they'd be tired. The kind of tired you get from hard physical labor. I asked Travis about it once, what kind of work they were doing that paid so well. He got real angry. Told me to mind my own business. Told me it was family stuff and that it was better if I didn't know. She shivered at the memory. That was when I started getting really scared. That was when I started planning to leave. Brenda had given them everything. She had provided the motive. A sudden influx of unexplained wealth. She had provided the timeline. The money started flowing shortly after Silas's murder. And she had provided the location. The secret hard labor was taking place at the abandoned mine owned by their cousin, the very spot where Silas's secret trail began. Driving away from the apartment complex, a grim sense of certainty settled over Flores and Jenna. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were locking into place with chilling precision. The family connection wasn't just a theory. It was the foundation of a secret family business. The sudden wealth wasn't luck. It was the proceeds of a crime. The abandoned mine wasn't a worthless property. It was a cover. It was the headquarters of a 5-year conspiracy, an operation born from greed and sealed with a murder. They now had a comprehensive blueprint of the crime. All that was left was to find the proof to tear it all down. Here is the second part of Act 3. Unraveling the Desert's Secret. It is a continuous narrative in English, approximately 2,500 words long, and seamlessly follows the previous part. The information from Brenda May was a bombshell, a flash of lightning that illuminated the entire dark landscape of their investigation. Back at the sheriff's office, standing before the evidence board, Flores and Jenna could now draw thick, undeniable lines connecting the Hayes brothers, Bert Corrigan, and the fountain of wealth that had mysteriously sprung forth right after Silas Whitaker's death. The motive was clear. The opportunity was clear. The conspiracy felt solid, real, and deeply sinister. "It's a perfect circle," Flores stated, tapping a finger on Bert Corrigan's hostile-looking mugshot. "Corrigan provides the location and the cover. The Hayes brothers provide the muscle and the greed. For 5 years, they've been running a secret, multi-million-dollar mining operation right under everyone's noses, funded by a murder." "And it all started with my uncle finding something they wanted," Jenna added, her voice quiet. "Exactly," Flores affirmed. "But here's our problem. This is a great story. It's a compelling theory. But to a judge, that's all it is right now. A story told by a scorned ex-girlfriend. It's not enough to get a search warrant for that mine. Corrigan's lawyer would tear it apart in 5 minutes. To get inside, we need more than a motive. We need something concrete that ties them directly to Silas's discovery. We need to know what he found, and more importantly, how he found it." Ferobi. The investigation had reached a new kind of wall. They had the framework of the crime, but the intellectual core, the secret that Silas had died for, was still missing. The key, they both knew, lay somewhere in the legacy he had left behind. Not the gold, not the map, but his thoughts, his process. The answer had to be in his journals. That night, Jenna turned her drab motel room into an academic war room. She pinned copies of maps to the walls. She created timelines, cross-referencing dates from Brenda's testimony with the known date of her uncle's disappearance. And she spread the photocopied pages of Silas's journals across the bed, the floor, every available surface. This time she wasn't reading them for sentimental value, searching for the ghost of the man she remembered. She was reading them as a historian, analyzing a primary source document in a murder investigation. She was hunting for his methodology. For hours, she was lost in his cramped, looping handwriting. Much of it was familiar notes on weather patterns, observations of wildlife, sketches of rock formations. But now, armed with the knowledge of the UV map and the secret gold, she saw the entries through a new lens. She began to focus on passages she had previously dismissed as the rambling of an old man obsessed with folklore. Passages where Silas wrote about the lies of the mountain and the story everyone believes. And then she found it. A series of entries from the summer of 2007, just a few months before he died. "The Sparrow legend is a beautiful lie," he had written. "A perfect piece of misdirection. Everyone looks for it where the story says it should be. But the geology there is all wrong. I've checked the old county assays from the 1882nd. It's low-grade ore, nothing to build a legend on. The story is the treasure, because it keeps people from looking in the right place. And a clue." Jenna's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a dreamer. This was a critical thinker, a historical revisionist. Her uncle had been doing archival research, just as she would have done. He was deconstructing the myth. A few pages later, another entry made her sit bolt upright. The original Sparrow claim, filed 1882. The family that filed it, the McClearys, also held the water rights for the entire western slope of the basin, including the land that would one day become the tourist mine. But their big strike wasn't on their claim. They were smart. They filed a small legal claim on a worthless patch, then built up a fantastic story around it. A legend. And while every other fool was running around looking for the Sparrow's ghost, the McClearys were quietly pulling the real prize out of the ground somewhere else nearby. The legend was their watchdog. Jenna grabbed her phone, her hands shaking with excitement. She called Flores. "I've got it," she said, her voice electric. "I know what he was doing. My God, Flores. He wasn't looking for the lost Sparrow mine. He was trying to prove it never existed." She explained her discovery, her voice a torrent of academic passion. He believed the legend was a deliberate decoy, a smokescreen created by the original miners to protect their real, richer discovery somewhere nearby. He wasn't a treasure hunter detective. He was a historical detective. He was solving a 130-year-old fraud. The revelation was stunning. It reframed Silas completely, elevating him from a simple prospector into her intellectual peer. He had used history as his map. Jenna quickly cross-referenced his notes on the real prize with the old property surveys and the layout of the Sparrow Creek tourist attraction. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with an almost audible snap. The tourist mines forgotten, deeper tunnels, the ones not on any of the public maps, ran directly along the border of the adjacent federal land. The same federal land where Silas's research suggested the true vein was hidden. The tourist mine wasn't just a convenient cover for the Hayes brothers' modern operation. It had been the original, historical key for Silas to access his discovery. With this new, profound understanding of Silas's mind, Jenna and Flores met one last time in front of the evidence board. They were ready to reconstruct the crime not as a theory, but as a sequence of events, a story that fit every single piece of evidence they had. It began with Silas, the historian, poring over dusty archives, realizing the celebrated local legend was a lie. This quiet, intellectual breakthrough was his first and most important discovery. With this knowledge, he identified the true target area and realized that the only practical way to reach it, undetected, was through the labyrinthine tunnels of the defunct Sparrow Creek mine. They could picture him in those final weeks, a man alive with a secret knowledge. He wasn't just prospecting, he was confirming a historical hypothesis. He would park his truck, enter the abandoned mine, and navigate the dark, dangerous lower levels, following his research and his instincts. And then came the day of his triumph. Deep within the earth on protected federal land, he broke through a rock wall or followed a forgotten shaft and found it. A virgin vein of gold, richer than anything he had ever seen, with a unique chemical signature that was his alone. It was the vindication of his entire life. But he wasn't alone in his obsession. The Hayes brothers, crude and greedy, had been watching him for months. They didn't understand his methods, but they saw his relentless focus. They saw a man who was on to something. Perhaps they followed him one day, keeping their distance, their flashlights off. Or perhaps they simply saw him emerge from the mine, his face alight with a joy he couldn't hide, his prospecting bag heavy with samples. The confrontation was inevitable. With their cousin Bert Corrigan standing guard at the mine's entrance, controlling the only easy way in or out, the three of them had a perfect trap. They cornered the old man, perhaps in the tunnels, perhaps as he was about to leave. They demanded his discovery, his location, his gold. Silas Whitaker, who had spent a lifetime chasing this single moment of truth, would not have given it up. He would have stood his ground. An argument would have erupted, his quiet defiance meeting their violent greed. It turned physical. And in the struggle, in the dark heart of the earth, one of them, likely Travis, the one with the history of explosive anger, picked up Silas's own geologist's hammer and brought it down. The life of the dreamer was ended by the very tool of his dreams. The murder was followed by a panicked, clumsy cover-up. They dragged his body far away, wrapping it in a tarp and burying it in a sandy wash, hoping the flash floods would do the rest. They took his prospecting tools to support the narrative of a man who had simply wandered off into the desert to continue his search. It was a simple, believable story. Their fatal mistake was their ignorance. They looked at his carefully preserved map, saw only a cheap souvenir, and tossed it back with the body, unaware that they were discarding the very blueprint to the treasure. For 5 years their secret held. Under the cover of "helping Cousin Bert," they ran a sophisticated mining operation. They used modern tools to extract the gold from Silas's vein, hauled it out through the abandoned tourist mine, and slowly, carefully, sold the raw gold through illicit channels, transforming it into the cash that funded their new lives. They were living on a dead man's dream. As the full, chilling narrative settled in the room, Flores stood back from the board. "It's a perfect theory," she said, her voice a mix of admiration and frustration. "It fits every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every single secret we've uncovered." She turned to Jenna. "But it's still just a story we're telling ourselves. To make it stick, we have to prove it." Jenna looked at the picture of the padlocked gate at the Sparrow Creek mine. Her eyes, no longer filled with the sadness of a grieving niece, now held the sharp, focused glint of a hunter. "Then we need to find a way to get inside that mine," she said. The theory was perfect. It was a beautiful, chilling, and logical construct that accounted for every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every secret they had unearthed. In the investigation room, Jenna and Detective Flores could trace the entire 5-year conspiracy on the board, from the historical research of Silas Whittaker to the modern-day greed of the Hayes-Corrigan clan. They had the motive, the means, the opportunity, and the timeline. What they didn't have was a single piece of physical evidence linking the suspects to the crime scene. The entire case, compelling as it was, remained circumstantial. Detective Flores laid out their meticulously constructed theory to the Maricopa County District Attorney. The DA, a sharp, pragmatic man with a deep respect for Flores, listened intently. He agreed that the narrative was powerful and likely true. But when Flores formally requested a search warrant for the Sparrow Creek mine, he slowly shook his head. "Maria, I believe you," he said, his tone one of genuine regret. "It's a hell of a story, but a judge will see it as exactly that, a story. Your primary witness is a resentful ex-girlfriend. Your other evidence is a family connection and a lot of good, solid conjecture. You have nothing that physically places the Hayes brothers or Bert Corrigan in contact with Silas Whittaker. Nothing that proves a secret mining operation is currently active on that property. Corrigan's lawyer will argue that this is a baseless fishing expedition, a violation of his client's Fourth Amendment rights. And he'll be right. The warrant will be denied. My hands are tied." The meeting was a dead end. The law, designed to protect the innocent, had become a shield for the guilty. They were standing at the gates of the fortress, knowing the truth was inside, but the walls were too high. The frustration was a palpable thing in the car on the ride back to the station. They were so close, yet legally, they were miles away. "So that's it?" Jenna asked, the fight in her voice replaced by a weary disbelief. "They just get away with it because Bert Corrigan owns the land where they committed the crime?" "For now, it looks that way," Flores admitted, her hands tight on the steering wheel. "Unless we can pull a rabbit out of a hat, we're stuck. Back in the investigation room, Jenna stared at the evidence board, at the grainy photograph of the crooked, cartoonish sign for the Sparrow Creek mine. It was a monument to failure, a symbol of forgotten history. And that's when the gears in her historian's mind, honed by years of looking at the past to solve the puzzles of the present, began to turn in a different direction. All this time, they had been trying to breach the wall with the tools of criminal law. They had been thinking like cops. Maybe it was time to think like a historian. "Wait a minute," Jenna said slowly, her eyes fixed on the photograph. "Flores, what is a mine, really? It's a business, yes, but an old one like this, it's also a historical site." Flores looked at her, not quite following. "What are you getting at, Professor?" "We're trying to get in with a criminal key, and the door is locked," Jenna explained, her voice quickening with a new idea. "What if we try an academic one? Many of these old mines, especially the ones from the 19th century mining booms, weren't just simple claims. They were formal corporations, established with complex charters on land that was often granted by the government. Sometimes, to encourage scientific and industrial development, those charters came with strings attached, covenants, clauses, things that no one has thought about in 100 years. It was a long shot, a desperate academic gamble. But it was the only shot they had. The hunt shifted from the present to the distant past. Jenna traded the evidence board for her laptop, diving headfirst into the digital archives of the state of Arizona. This was her territory. She wasn't just Googling, she was navigating obscure databases of historical documents, pulling up digitized land grants, incorporation filings, and territorial legal records from the 1882nd. The work was painstaking. She scrolled through thousands of pages of scanned handwritten documents, the spidery cursive and arcane legal language, a challenge for even a trained historian. She was looking for a ghost, a forgotten clause in a 140-year-old document. Days blurred into nights. Flores would check in, bringing coffee, her own hope beginning to wane as Jenna reported one dead end after another. The sheer volume of paper, even in its digital form, was immense. And then, late one night, fueled by caffeine and sheer force of will, she found it. It was buried on page 17 of the original 1882 land grant and incorporation charter for the Sparrow Creek Mining Company. The language was dense, but the meaning was unmistakable. The document contained a section titled "The Historical and Geological Access Covenant." The clause, likely a standard piece of boilerplate legal language at the time, stipulated that for the mining company to maintain its charter and its rights to the land, it must grant reasonable access to accredited scholars from recognized institutions for the purpose of historical survey or geological study. It was a forgotten string, attached a century ago to encourage scientific discovery, and it had never been legally severed. Through all the bankruptcies and changes of ownership, the covenant remained tied to the land deed itself. It was legal, it was binding, and it was their key. It was the rabbit in the hat. The next morning, Jenna Whitaker walked into civil court, not as a victim's family member, but as a professor of American history. She presented her academic credentials, her formal request for a one-day survey of a registered historical site, and the 140-year-old charter that legally obligated the current landowner to grant her access. She didn't mention murder, gold, or the Hayes brothers. Her argument was purely academic. Bert Corrigan's lawyer, a low-rent local attorney, was summoned and blustered about privacy and harassment, but he had no legal ground to stand on. The covenant was clear. The judge, a stern woman with a deep respect for the letter of the law, reviewed the ancient document. She saw no ambiguity. She granted the request. She issued a formal court order, compelling Bert Corrigan to provide full and unimpeded access to the Sparrow Creek mine property for a period of 8 hours to Professor Jenna Whitaker and her designated research team for the completion of an academic survey. Jenna walked out of the courthouse, holding the signed order. The piece of paper felt heavy in her hand, more powerful than any weapon or warrant. They had failed to break down the front door, so Jenna had found a key to a secret side entrance, a key that had been hiding in plain sight for over a century. The academic trap had been set. The morning of the survey was cool and clear. A small convoy of white vans, each bearing the discreet logo of a local university's geology department, rolled up the dusty track to the Sparrow Creek mine. Inside were Professor Jenna Whitaker, Detective Maria Flores, and their research team, 6 of the county's top forensic specialists, dressed convincingly in khaki field pants, worn boots, and university sweatshirts. They looked every bit the part of academics ready for a day of dusty work. Bert Corrigan was waiting for them at the chained gate, as they knew he would be. He stood with his feet planted wide, the ever-present shotgun held not just in the crook of his arm, but at a low, ready position. His face, normally a mask of sour resentment, was now a canvas of purple rage. "I told you to get lost," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the morning quiet. "This is trespassing. I'll have every single one of you arrested." Detective Flores stepped out of the lead van, her expression unreadable. She didn't flash her badge. She simply held up the court order. "Mr. Corrigan," she said, her voice calm and carrying, "this is a legally binding directive from a judge of the Maricopa County Superior Court. It compels you to grant us unimpeded access. If you interfere in any way, you will be in contempt of court and arrested immediately. The choice is yours." Corrigan snatched the paper from her hand. His eyes, small and furious, scanned the legal language. He read it once, then twice, his face falling as the words sank in. He looked from the official court seal to Jenna's calm, determined face, then to the team of academics waiting patiently. He saw no fear, only purpose. He had been so focused on defending against the police that he had never imagined an attack would come from the library. He had been perfectly, legally, and brilliantly outmaneuvered. With a guttural roar of pure frustration, he threw the court order to the ground, stalked over to the gate, and with trembling, angry hands fumbled with the padlock. The heavy chain fell away with a clang. He glared at them, his eyes promising a violence his legal position could no longer deliver. "Fine," he spat. "Go play in the dirt. You've got 8 hours. Then I want every last one of you off my property." The team filed past him in silence, ignoring his venomous stare. As they walked toward the ominous, dark entrance of the mine, the victory felt electric. They had breached the fortress. The moment they stepped inside, the world changed. The blistering Arizona heat vanished, replaced by a deep, subterranean cold that felt like it was seeping from the rock itself. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth, mildew, and the faint, metallic scent of old iron. Their powerful headlamps cut sharp cones of light through an absolute darkness, revealing a scene of profound decay. Rotting support timbers groaned under the immense weight of the mountain. The ground was littered with rusted, forgotten tools from a bygone era. The only sounds were the dripping of water from unseen fissures and the crunch of their own boots on the gravelly floor. It was a tomb, and they all felt the palpable danger of becoming its next occupants. They were following Silas Whitaker's ghost. A forensic tech swept a portable, high-powered UV lamp across the tunnel walls. The ghostly, invisible ink of Silas's trail markers was their guide. While the main tourist tunnels were wide and relatively stable, Silas's secret map led them down narrower, more treacherous paths into sections of the mine that had clearly not been maintained for a century. Several times they had to cross rickety-looking chasms on planks left by miners long dead. The sheer risk he had undertaken alone was staggering. After nearly an hour of careful navigation, they arrived at the spot indicated on Silas's map. It was, as it appeared, a dead end. The tunnel simply stopped, choked by a massive, messy rockfall that reached the ceiling. For a heart-stopping moment, a feeling of failure washed over the team. Had they come all this way for nothing? Jenna, holding the master map, did not waver. She shone her light on a small, cryptic note her uncle had written in the margin, a note she had puzzled over for days. "The story is the lie. The wood is the door." "It's not a collapse," she said, her voice certain. "It's a construction. Look closer." The team began to examine the rockfall with new eyes. Pushing aside the loose rocks and debris at the front, they found it. The dead end was not stone. It was a solid wall of thick, old wooden timbers, stacked horizontally and masterfully camouflaged with dirt, dust, and strategically placed rocks to blend in perfectly with the rest of the tunnel. It was a false wall. A door. A specialist inserted the hooked end of a Halligan bar into a small gap between the timbers and pried. With a groan of stressed wood, the timber moved. A puff of stale, different air hissed out from the gap, air that was warmer, carrying the unmistakable scent of diesel exhaust and machine oil. They had found it. Working together, they tore down the barrier, timber by heavy timber. The scene that greeted them on the other side was breathtaking. They stepped from a 19th century crypt into a 21st century crime scene. The chamber beyond was huge, professionally excavated, and brightly lit by a string of harsh industrial lamps powered by a noisy diesel generator humming away in the corner. The air was warm and circulated by electric fans. This was no forgotten tunnel. It was an active, illegal industrial worksite. Pneumatic drills, hoses, and power cables snaked across the floor. Carts filled with ore stood on a small, newly laid section of track. A workbench was littered with modern tools, empty cans of soda and discarded food wrappers. A calendar from the current year, 2012, was tacked to a support beam. This place wasn't a secret from the past. It was a secret of the present. And in the far corner of the chamber, like a dark altar to their greed, sat a heavy, black, padlocked iron box. The team gathered around it, the generator's hum the only sound. The air was thick with a sense of finality. A forensic tech stepped forward with a large pair of bolt cutters. With a single, powerful squeeze, the heavy lock snapped and fell away with a metallic thud. Flores looked at Jenna, a silent acknowledgment of the journey that had brought them to this moment. Then, with gloved hands, she lifted the heavy lid. The contents stole the breath from everyone in the chamber. On top were dozens of heavy canvas bags. Flores opened one and poured the contents onto a sorting tray. Raw gold nuggets, hundreds of them, cascaded out, gleaming under the harsh lights. It was a king's ransom. Beneath the bags of gold was a simple, spiral-bound notebook. A ledger. Jenna picked it up as if it were a sacred text. She opened it. The pages were filled with her uncle's familiar, cramped handwriting on the first page, followed by years of a different, cruder script. It was a meticulous 5-year record of their crime. Dates, weights in ounces, and estimated values. A detailed accounting of their secret profits, a multi-million-dollar enterprise built on a foundation of murder. Finally, at the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a greasy, stained rag, was the final, terrible truth. Flores reached in and carefully lifted it out. It was a geologist's hammer, its steel head pitted and worn. And on one face of the hammer, a dark reddish-brown stain was clearly visible, a permanent shadow on the metal. The forensic team, working with quiet, practiced efficiency, confirmed everything in minutes. A specialist used a portable X-ray fluorescence analyzer, pointing it first at a nugget from the box, then at one of the original evidence nuggets found on Silas's body 5 years ago. The device beeped. The screen flashed. 99.8% correlation, a perfect chemical match. Another specialist carefully swabbed the dark stain on the hammer. He applied a few drops of solution from a field testing kit. The swab instantly turned a deep, unmistakable blue. A positive, presumptive test for blood. They had it all: the hoard, the financial records, and the murder weapon. Every last piece of their theory, born from a ghostly map and a historian's intuition, was now irrefutable scientific fact. The trap had been sprung and the secrets of the desert were finally, completely exposed. The silence in the secret chamber beneath the Sparrow Creek mine was broken only by the hum of the generator, a sound that suddenly seemed pathetic and doomed. The forensic team had their proof, irrefutable and absolute. Detective Flores looked at Jenna, a silent, shared acknowledgment passing between them. The long hunt was over. Flores raised her radio to her lips. "All teams," she said, her voice cold and clear as steel. "We have confirmation. Execute the warrants. Now." Comes it. At the first light of dawn, the high desert quiet was shattered. 2 separate SWAT teams, moving with silent, deadly precision, descended simultaneously on the new, comfortable homes of Jed and Travis Hayes. Doors were breached with explosive force. The brothers, who had woken up believing this was just another day in their 5-year run of stolen prosperity, were dragged from their beds, their shock and confusion absolute as they were thrown to the ground and bound in zip ties. Their ill-gotten paradise had become a tactical nightmare in a matter of seconds. Miles away, at the Sparrow Creek mine, a 3rd team moved in on the dilapidated house where Bert Corrigan was sleeping. There was no need for a dynamic entry. Corrigan, who had been left stewing in a state of paranoid anxiety after the academic survey, surrendered without a fight, his face a mask of pale, sweaty defeat. He knew, as he was being cuffed, that whatever the academics had been looking for, they had found it. The secret he had guarded for 5 years had finally been unearthed. The three cousins, united in their crime, were now united in their capture. In the sterile confines of an interrogation room, the bravado of Jed Hayes had evaporated. He sat slumped in a metal chair, his face gray with exhaustion and fear. Across the table, Detective Flores was silent. She simply placed the heavy iron box on the table between them and opened the lid. She didn't say a word. She just laid the evidence out, one piece at a time. First, a heavy bag of the unique, raw gold. Jed flinched as if he'd been struck. Next, she opened the ledger and turned it to a page filled with his own crude handwriting, detailing the weight of the gold they had extracted in the first year. Finally, she took out the oily rag, unwrapped it, and placed the geologist's hammer on the table. The dark biological stain on its head seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Jed stared at the hammer, his breathing shallow. That was the ghost. That was the object that had haunted his sleep for half a decade. The wall of denial he had maintained in his mind crumbled into dust. "We found him, Jed," Flores said softly. "We found Silas." A dry sob escaped Jed's throat. And then, the story, held back by years of fear and guilt, came pouring out. It was a pathetic, rambling confession, a desperate attempt to paint himself in a better light, to shift the ultimate blame. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he began, his voice raspy. We were just watching him. For months. We knew he was onto something big. He had that look in his eye. The man was practically glowing. We were sick of breaking our backs for nothing while he was about to hit the mother lode." He recounted how they had followed Silas into the mine that fateful day, how their cousin Bert had made sure no one else would come sniffing around. They had waited for Silas to emerge from the deeper tunnels, his bag heavy, his face triumphant. "We just wanted to talk to him," Jed insisted, his eyes pleading. "Make a deal, a partnership. We confronted him. He was a stubborn old fool. He wouldn't listen. He said the mountain had given the secret to him, not to us." He clutched that bag of his like it was his own child. The story tumbled out, detailing the argument, the shouting match echoing in the dark tunnels. "He tried to push past us. Travis grabbed him. They started wrestling, struggling over the bag. Cy was stronger than he looked. He wouldn't let go." Jed's eyes squeezed shut, as if replaying the final horrific moments. "Travis he lost it. He ripped the hammer from the loop on C's belt. He just went crazy. He swung it, just once. It was all so fast." He looked up at Flores, tears of self-pity streaming down his face. "I never touched him, I swear. It was Travis. He's the one who killed him." He went on to detail the panicked cover-up, how Corrigan had helped them move the body and devised the plan to exploit the mine, how they had meticulously laundered the gold over the years. The confession was complete. The case was closed. The trial was a formality. Faced with Jed's confession and the mountain of physical evidence, the Hayes brothers and Bert Corrigan were found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy, and illegal mining on federal land. The judge, calling their crime a profound act of parasitic greed, sentenced all three to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The mine that Silas Whittaker had discovered was formally documented by the U.S. Geological Survey. It was recognized as a significant new lode, and in an official act it was named the Whittaker Vein, forever cementing the old prospector's name into the history of the land he so loved. Justice, in its slow, grinding way, had finally been served. In the weeks that followed, Jenna Whittaker found herself in meetings with lawyers and government officials. As Silas's sole heir, she was legally entitled to the rights and a significant portion of the value of the Whittaker vein, a sum that would have made her wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. The lawyers presented her with the paperwork, a life of unimaginable luxury just a signature away. She looked at the documents, but she didn't see numbers. She saw the dark stain on her uncle's hammer. She saw his ghost in a dusty wash. The gold was not a prize. It was a relic of a tragedy. It was tainted with his blood. A few months later, Jenna stood at a podium in a lecture hall at Arizona State University, not far from the mountains where her uncle had spent his life. The room was filled with students, faculty, and reporters. My uncle, Silas Whittaker, was a dreamer, she began, her voice clear and steady. For most of my life, I'm ashamed to say, I saw that as a weakness. I saw his passion as foolishness. I was wrong. My uncle's dream wasn't about getting rich. It was about the thrill of the unknown, the joy of discovery, and the deep, personal satisfaction of solving a puzzle that the earth itself had set. She paused, looking out at the young faces in the audience. That dream was stolen from him by men who could only see the value of gold and not the value of the journey. They can keep their gold. I am here today to reclaim my uncle's true legacy. She announced that she was refusing all personal claims to the mine. Instead, she was using the initial finder's fees, government rewards, and the power of his story to establish a permanent endowment for the university, the Whittaker Exploration Scholarship. This fund, she declared, will provide full tuition and research grants to geology students who demonstrate what my uncle embodied: a relentless curiosity, a respect for history, and a passion for the field. It will not be a reward for being the best student, but for being the most intrepid explorer. She smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile. It is my hope that this scholarship will ensure that my uncle's spirit, the spirit of the true Epsilon Eta Epsilon Rho Epsilon Upsilon Nu Eta Tau Is, the explorer will live on, not by hoarding the treasure he found, but by nurturing the next generation of discoverers who will, in his name, go out and find their own. She had transformed his lonely, violent death into a living legacy of education and inspiration. She had taken the thing that had been used to ridicule him his dream and forged it into his greatest monument. The gold would stay in the mountain. The real treasure, the spirit of Silas Whittaker, was now free. In the end, the story of Silas Whittaker is a modern tragedy, a stark lesson in how the simple, brutal engine of human greed can extinguish a brilliant light. It is a story of a passion that was murdered by those who could never comprehend it, a dream of discovery that was undone by men who could only see the value of the destination, and never the priceless joy of the journey. The Hayes brothers and Bert Corrigan looked at a mountain and saw only the gold within it. Silas Whittaker looked at the same mountain and saw a story, a puzzle, a 100-year-old secret waiting to be told. His life's work was not about what he could take from the earth, but what he could learn from it. But if his death was a tragedy, his legacy became a testament to a different, more powerful human force. Not the love of gold, but the love of truth. Ultimately, the greatest discovery Silas Whittaker left behind was not the rich vein of gold that bears his name. It was the truth of his life and death, a truth that lay buried even deeper than the treasure, unearthed not by a pickaxe, but by the relentless, guilt-fueled love of the niece who had once doubted him most. Months later, under the long shadows of a setting Arizona sun, Jenna Whittaker stood alone at the entrance to the Whittaker Lode. The site was now protected, marked by an official federal sign that bore her family's name. The entrance to the mine was sealed by a heavy iron gate, its secrets now safe forever. In her hand she held a single rough nugget of gold, the last piece of physical evidence, given to her as a memento. She let the last rays of sunlight glint off its surface, the raw metal shining with a beauty that was forever intertwined with violence and sorrow. It was the beginning and the end of the story. It was worth a fortune, and it had cost a life. For a long moment she simply held it, feeling its weight and the weight of the history it contained. Then, with a quiet resolution, she drew her arm back and threw the nugget through the bars of the gate. It vanished into the absolute blackness of the mine with a faint, clattering echo, returning to the earth that had hidden it for so long. She had not come to the desert to find a treasure. She had come seeking justice. And in the long, arduous process, she had found something more profound, a connection to the spirit of the uncle she had never truly understood. By giving his discovery away, she had honored it more than by keeping it. By letting go of the gold, she had finally taken hold of his true legacy. A gentle, peaceful smile touched her lips. She turned her back on the darkness of the mine and walked away, her silhouette framed against the brilliant, fading colors of the desert sky.